Welcome to another Unwinding with Fiber and Fabric. You might notice that I am in a little bit different location than is my norm when I make these videos. I'm in my office. Yes, a lot of my small crafting supplies and some of my fabric is kept in this space. It's amazing how you make things work. And so I'm in my little office. You might be able to hear the computer running in the background. If so, I apologize. Hopefully there won't be too much noise disruption. With that being said, I wasn't really expecting to make a video today when I woke up. I certainly didn't have anything planned. I had something I was hoping to have done for this month. But other things keep coming up that are important. And so, like many of us who do crafting, I keep putting off the things that are less time, of time demand. So my English paper piecing quilt, which is what I was hoping to get started, assembling all the blocks this month and have it so I can start hand quilting on it, it has been delayed at least until next week. So I'm here in my office and I'm doing this video without having planned to do this video because earlier this morning I thought, oh, it's getting to the end of March. I missed making a video in February. I don't want to miss March to update everyone on how I'm doing and what I'm doing. But I didn't really know what I was going to have to share. And I was like, well, maybe next week I'll get my English paper piecing quilt put together so that I'm hand quilting it and I'll share about that. And I really thought, yeah, I will do a video in the very last days of March. But then I ended up seeing a post on social media talking about a subject that I think is very dear and a concern to many of us that craft, whether we are doing spinning or knitting or quilting. It is a topic that I think is of concern and one that I think we all at some level or another pay attention to, whether we are always aware that we're paying as much attention to it as we do. That is, of course, debatable with our own selves. But I saw this topic and I realized I couldn't sit on my hands. I had to respond in sympathy and empathy for the person who was posting. And that with my unique background, it was going to end up being one of my pithy posts at some point. So later today, which will probably either coincide with this video going out or precede this video going out, I will be doing a pithy pondering on my pithyponderings.com, doing a more concise typed version of what I probably will convey in this video. So regardless of where you, my viewer, are watching this from, I know that the instability of the markets and of the social stability, the political stability, I know that it is something that you are aware of, and some of you are feeling it much more acutely than maybe others. How this relates to fiber and the unwinding with fiber and fabric. So to rewind just a little bit, many of you, if you have been following me for a while, and if you have gone to my pithyponderings.com and you have looked at my different social medias, you've looked up my footprint, many of you may have already uncovered a little bit about my backstory. My backstory is that I am someone who grew up on a farm. I grew up on a large dairy farm. I am 7 generations. I have 7 generations, the same location, cattle and dairy and orchards. And when I graduated from high school, I traveled cross country and I went to school in Virginia. And while going to school in Virginia, I studied international relations. I then returned back to the western part of the United States. I got married. I had children. And eventually I was able to get my master's degree in military and diplomatic history. And this was a major accomplishment for me because by this point, the underlying health conditions that had always been there had become quite pronounced and were threatening my ability to do the things I loved. I had never lived close enough in my married years to a location where I could work on my academic pursuits. My goal was to become a professor, specifically a professor in international relations. Well, the world changed. And in the 20 years between when I graduated from college and technology advanced to where it was really much more easy for me to pursue my education, the world had changed. And rather than pursuing international relations because the subject matter had changed, they called it something different, I was able to get a master's degree in military and diplomatic history with a strong concentration on diplomatic history. By this point, I had been a military wife, and at the end of getting my master's degree, I also became a military mom. So that's who I am outside of unwinding with fiber and fabric. Textiles, quilting especially. That was what I did. That's what I learned from my grandmother. Knitting, I learned from my mother. Crochet, I learned from my mother. My grandmother was just a phenomenal crochet artist. She struggled sometimes with knitting patterns. She would never have considered herself an artist, but when it came to following a crochet pattern, whether it was in the grid form or in a recipe form, using general terms there, regardless of the way the crochet pattern was presented to her, she could duplicate it. She could replicate it. She made doily after doily, and she made the thread crochet that just astounds me. That just really astounds me. And she was able to do that up until Parkinson's really stole away her use of her hands. She liked hand quilting. She was a practical farmer's wife and a farmer's daughter. And she liked the practicality of the quilting. She liked the practicality of making some of her own clothes, especially in her later life, because she could make the things that would fit her as her body was changing long before they realized that Parkinson's is what she was suffering from. The last stitches that she ever took are in a baby quilt, one of the panel quilts where it's just a printed panel and you're just quilting around the lines. The last stitches of quilting that she ever did was in that as we were doing it together when I came home after college. So my connection with textiles, my connection with fiber comes back to my roots. And it comes back to the roots that I think a lot of individuals, especially here in the United States, have experienced if they talk to their grandmothers, talk to their great-grandmothers. If my generation talked to the generations that came before, one of the things that is a commonality, regardless of where we are in the United States, is that little by little we put aside things like the weaving and the spinning. We put aside some of these crafts because it was just cheaper to go to the store. It was cheaper to go to Sears and JCPenney and buy our stuff. We could now buy printed fabric. We could buy sheets that had beautiful colors and designs on it. We didn't have to take a simple white sheet or a simple plain colored sheet and embellish it in order to beautify our home. And so many of our predecessors, the ones who had lived through the Great Depression, the ones who grew up in the Great Depression, the ones who had grown up, started their families during World War II. Many of them were more than happy to become the huge consumer populace that the United States became. Whether it was consumerism in the sewing room or consumerism in the kitchen, many, like my grandmother, were more than happy to give up the necessity and replace it with the convenience. But like my grandmother, many of these women didn't give up their hobbies. A lot did. A lot did because there were other hobbies they wanted to take up. My grandmother stayed a farmer's wife, and she did her crochet, and she had her African violets in her house, and she had her begonias and petunias. Words that I am never sure if I'm pronouncing correctly because I only heard them spoken by her, and they were always with a very interesting accent. An accent that is definitely from where I grew up, but is one that is probably greatly influenced by her German grandfather and her very English, Scandinavian neighbors growing up. So I tell you this story about my backstory, where I learned my fiber and fabric and techniques. And then, due to a ton of things that will never be discussed in front of the camera, I packed up and I headed east, and I delved into a topic that nobody in my family had ever studied. I tried different things and thought of different career paths that, in all truth, rather shocked my family at home. But at the end, when I went home, I was still surrounded by my grandmother, who was still, even though the Parkinson's made it nearly impossible for her, who was still someone who passionately loved her handcrafts. My great-grandmother was still alive, and she passionately loved quilting, the hand quilting. And I'm not sure, I'm not sure if she ever enjoyed the sitting at the sewing machine. I think, honestly, she was much more, let me sit in my lap and do needlework and hand quilting, as opposed to sitting at the sewing machine, and I totally get that. I am so much like that. And even my grandmother who crocheted. My grandmother who crocheted loved sitting and listening to the radio. My grandfather was all about movies and TV, and he had a big gigantic TV in his bedroom, and he would go in after he'd come home from being out on the farm. He'd come home and he would sit down in his big comfy chair, and he would watch movie after movie after movie and TV show, and he just loved it. He loved the video, the visual. My grandmother, on the other hand, would listen to, she would, I don't know if she ever listened to talk radio, honestly. And of course, talk radio back then was completely different than talk radio today. But one of the things she did discover a real passion for is she loved listening to basketball on the radio. I'm not sure she was a huge basketball fan, but she loved listening to basketball on the radio. And so she would sit in her chair and she'd listen to basketball and she'd crochet. So this is the influence in my life. My mom was a self-taught knitter. She didn't know that there was different ways of knitting, and so she learned continental knitting, and that's what I learned. These were different days. These were different times, and my mom, even finding cotton yarn to knit with was a struggle. Most of everything she knit, at least from the 1980s onward, was knit with acrylic. It was all she could find. It was all she could source. Her earliest knitting, back when I was just a little tiny toddler, her earliest knitting was with wool. But by the time she took up knitting with a real passion again in the mid 1980s, acrylic was all she could find. She did start to find a small knitting store. And this is getting me to what today's topic is. She did find a small knitting store about a half hour, 45 minutes away. that she could go and get little tiny little balls of fluffy Angora to add to the acrylic yarn baby booties that she was making. She could not afford the other yarns in the store. She would use the Angora just as a little accent on the top of the toes of the baby booties. And that way, that little expensive skein of yarn would go a long way. She passed away before I got into knitting. I had planned on getting into knitting. I had the Angora rabbits. She passed away before I became a spinner. I shouldn't say, I'm sorry, I said knitting earlier, before I got into spinning. If I said that incorrectly, I'm sorry. She passed away the year before. In fact, I bought my spinning wheel the same spring that she passed away. And I took up spinning, and my goal was to learn how to spin the Angora, even though she wasn't going to be able to knit with it. That had always been my goal, was to spin. My first spinning wheel was paid for because of my mom having passed away and her estate providing me the financial security to make the expenditure. Sorry, I'm a little emotional. This week is the anniversary of when she passed away. So it's all fresh. But that's how I got into spinning. So this morning, when I wasn't planning on doing this video, when I didn't have a topic to cover, and I'm sorry, I know my face is getting all red, but this is important. Otherwise, I wouldn't, I would be going about my day. I happened to go on Facebook and I saw a post by my local yarn store. And my local yarn store was sharing an article that was shared, a video that was shared by a local, a semi-local state, one of the nearby states, one of the suppliers that she knows. They shared a video talking about how the tariffs were really starting to cause an impact. And in short, what people don't realize is all these indie dyers, all these indie yarn companies, most of them are getting their supplies. Most of these stores, most of these local yarn stores get a bulk of their yarns from overseas. And I know all of you over in the UK, you are aware of how politics can make things difficult. I follow enough indie dyers from the UK to have watched how all of a sudden the shrinking of markets, the tariffs that come when you're not part of the organization, when the Brexit made it so that all of a sudden you now had to jump through more hoops to sell and to purchase, more hoops than you'd had to do before Brexit. I have been following this. You see, back when I was studying international relations, all of those many years ago, I was required to take economics classes. I was required to take a horrible class called international economics that nearly did in all of us that were politics-centered students. The economics majors didn't like the class either, but we had to take it and we had to pass. And so I had to work really hard to make sure that I passed that class. It was a class that still talked about the gold standard. It was a class that talked about the history of international economics in the 20th century. And I had to pass it, and so I did. So despite the fact that it was not something I would have voluntarily taken, I took it. And today, it has a huge impact on my ability to look and see and track what the trends are. It doesn't help me. It doesn't help me with my own personal finance. Let's just be clear. And that leads me to when I read this article and I read this local yarn store that I I really love, and I love their aesthetic. I love their model. I love the comfort that they provide. I loved spinning there. I loved buying their fiber when I could. It made me very sad. It made me very sad because, yes, they're going to feel the impact. And I didn't know how to even respond. But then I noticed a comment made by one of their patrons, one of the people who obviously follow them. And it was really interesting because the comment was actually hidden by Facebook. It was not listed as one that it was going to show. And I was like, that's interesting. And I read it and it upset me because it follows a theme that I've been seeing now since 2017. I heard a lot of people say, oh, well, we'll just tighten our belts and we'll be fine, as policies came through that decimated the people I grew up with, the world I grew up in. And what was horrifying is to know how many of the people like the people I grew up surrounded by, didn't understand the consequences of their vote until it was too late. Now, this is not I am not making a political statement here. I am not digging into or trying to create any kind of manifesto or political rally. I want to share what I did when I read this thing that upset me. I was upset because I understood what this this fiber store, this yarn store was going to go through. And yes, I'm well aware Joann's is going out of business and a lot of people won't have and won't know where to go. I have long since found other places and other ways to get my inexpensive, not cheap, inexpensive products. I have long since learned how to do these hobbies when I can't afford the luxury of these hobbies. But not everybody has learned this, and not everybody has the ability that even I have. My mom did not have even the financial ability I have to weather storms like this. And so I read this comment and it upset me, and I was like, no. I even texted my family. I showed them what it was and I said, I so want to comment. I so want to react. I so want to be that person. But I have learned that that's not what my voice is supposed to do. I make the pithy ponderings. I try to make things that are not political outcries and are not biased towards one group or another. The desire to be a professor, I may not be teaching in a school, but it is still there to try as much as possible to educate without my bias being something that is, my bias is there, but my bias is something that is not trying to convince others to change, just trying to inform. And it's why it's so upsetting, the things that are going on in the United States right now. And I do need to just say that it is so upsetting. It is making it very difficult for me to do the things I love to do because I'm constantly dealing with spoons being used up by seeing what my education has me see. So, already the video is a little longer than I expected. This is what I wrote, not in response to the person who made a comment, but in response to the yarn store owner. And if she is watching this, I want her to know how much I appreciate everything she is doing, and I do support her, even if I can't support her with my pocketbook, because things are just tight. Things are tighter than I'd like them to be going into what is clearly going to be a rough time. But like my grandmother taught me, I have a whole bunch of stuff stockpiled Not for the end day, but just because I buy things when it's on a bargain. And so I have sheds full of spinning fiber that I can spin, and I have bins full of fabric. I am good for a while. In fact, my family would appreciate if I did actually use from my stash a lot in these upcoming years. So this is what I wrote, and I wanted to share this, and so I'm going to read it. I have it on the computer screen behind me. And this goes out to all of you that are indie dyers and crafts people who may follow me. This goes out to the people who knit and are trying to find their sources. Especially if you're in the United States. And this is where I'm so looking at the UK and looking at Europe and looking at what you've been doing over the last 20, 30 years to try to avoid when, and in short, when you were threatened with losing so much of your small industry, your memories of times prior helped you hold on to some of it, helped you try to survive. Now we're all in the trying to survive. But here in the United States, we're a little bit different. We celebrated the removal of all things natural fiber and instead went all things plastic a long time ago. And even though we've had push to return to natural fibers, we're just so huge. We're just so huge that we can't recover in the time that everyone thinks we might be able to. And because when you're dealing with natural fibers, you're not talking about a synthetic process that you build a plant and then you make it. You have to grow, you have to raise, you have to rear, you have to breed, you have to cultivate the products. And while we do have people doing that, we do not have people doing it on a large enough scale to replace international markets. So this is what I wrote. You have my deep sympathy. U.S. textile history was the subject of my daughter's research in college. It was something we were both very interested in even before she began formally researching it. We've also closely watched how markets like the UK have dealt with the constriction of trade after years of more open trade. The sad truth, most people will simply give up the hobby and find something less expensive long before the few operating U.S. mills can ever produce enough to make the pricing competitive with the imports. Luxury and quality is available in the United States, but in much smaller quantities and varieties than on the world market. I really hope your shoppers who can afford luxury yarn step up and help you through this period of insanity. I wish I could do more, but I can only afford to knit with my hands spun right now. And that's the reality. For a lot of people, they've already been tightening their belts for a long time. We've already been tightening our belts for 10 years. There's not a lot more tightening of the belt we can do. We have to prioritize. And now we are looking, especially someone like my generation, we are not just looking at tightening our belts in order to be able to have what we need. We're tightening our belts so that we can help offset the things our children need, our grown children. This is a reality that my grandparents faced. This is their life that they lived. When they had extra, that extra went to their family in need. My grandfather, many times over, all through his adult life, provided extra food for his siblings when they were struggling. Even when they weren't struggling, he just did so out of the kindness and love for them. We will have the ability to withstand if we don't lose sight of the joy that we can find in sharing, in teaching, and loving. It will help us overcome the spoons that are dirtied every day, just staying where rather than hiding. I do not hide. I don't always have a video to share because it is hard to share my joy when I know others are struggling so hard to have joy. My life has things going on in the background that only a small circle of people know about. But we are trying to continually broaden our circle, encouraging others to, if nothing else, pass through our circle. We're trying to not constrict, even if we have to have constraints. We're trying to not be afraid, even though there is a lot to be afraid of. And even though those that are closest to us have been made very afraid in these times. So I come to you with a different unwinding with fiber and fabric. I want to make sure you know I am taking time to unwind. Right now, I'm still doing, I put it out on my my Pithy Ponderings. I have become the Pithy Dragon. I have a second Instagram page that is called the Pithy Dragon. I am having a wonderful time creating Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing games. There we go. My son laughs every time I get it right. Content. I am doing it because it is fun. It gives me joy. I'm also doing it because it is allowing me to use some of the skills that I have, that I use all the time when I create a pattern that I share. All these other skills that I have, it's allowing me to use that in a way and in a different audience than I ever thought was possible. It's allowing me to diversify in a time in which diversification is necessary. I'm not going to stop knitting, and I'm not going to stop crocheting, and I'm not going to stop my machine embroidery, and I'm not going to stop quilting. But I am probably going to be concentrating all of my efforts on using my stash, not buying anything new, recycling, reusing. In essence, using the skills that I learned at the knee of my grandmother, who long after the Depression was over, continued these provident living skills. So, I hope you are finding a way to unwind, whether it is fiber or fabric or anything else that brings you joy and health, recharges you, washes those spoons and restocks them in your drawer. I hope that you can find a way, not just to weather the storm, not just to survive the storm, but to thrive. It has been so many years since my mother passed away. I think it's been 17. It's hard. I don't want to. My son was teasing me. He's like, yeah, 40 years ago, this is what you're doing. I was like, no, it's not. 40 years, no. And I looked at my husband and said, 40 years ago, how old was I? And my husband laughed. He says, you were 15. I had a birthday, a milestone birthday this year. And he said, yeah, you were 15. I said, oh my goodness. There are times in your life when you have to pause and go, no, it can't have been that long. For some people, they think I'm much older than 55. For others, they think I'm much younger than 55. Age has never been something that defines me very well. I'm an old spirit in a body that hates me, in a body that's aging much faster than it should be. But I'm an old spirit who has been taught to seek joy, who has, in her youth, been bolstered to seek joy. Something that I am naturally adept at was sustained and supported and protected when I was a child, when so much else in my life was not protected, when so much else in my life was really, actually I now as an adult can go, was much worse than I could have ever comprehended. I did have people who, like my grandmother, like my great-grandfather, who I'm named after, who reminded me that being able to find joy in a storm is a special trait. And it's one that we should share if we have that trait. So, sorry for the tears. I don't like to cry in front of cameras. It makes my face all red. And I get really red. But I hope that you can find some time to unwind. I hope you can find some ways to unwind. If you want to follow me as the Pithy Dragon, by all means do. My son is the Inspirator, spelled incorrectly. I'll put the links. We spelled it incorrectly for a reason. I'll put the links in the description below. I hope that you can find ways to unwind. I will continue to find ways to unwind. Oh yes, and before I leave, I've been working behind the scenes on the Tour de Fleece 2025. Those of you that are on Ravelry and know me as Pioneer Lady, I have been working behind the scenes. I am ready. We've made some adjustments in order to take into consideration a lot of the changes that have been happening over the last decade. But we have tried to streamline. We have it there. And I will be spinning. I will be spinning in Tour de Fleece. I will be managing behind the scenes and managing probably up front and talking to all the new spinners and anybody who wants to chat with me. So it is still a few months away. My counsel for all of you, whether it is knitting or spinning, quilting, whatever it is you're doing, this is a good time to make a plan. Identify the important things you want to do in this upcoming year. Make a plan, budget for those things, and then find other ways to fill in the gaps. This is where the Provident Living really comes in. If we can only afford the one luxury item, how do we find the less luxury that we can now repurpose into a cherished treasure? We are not the first generation to face this. We are not the first time to face this. I won't say if we're the scariest time or not. But if we look to the artisans and artists of the past, if we look to the crafters and the homemakers of the past, we might, and we look to the fabulous, massively marvelous young people of the present, I think we can find some ways to find joy and live providently as much as possible so that we don't have to give up the hobby. We just have to repurpose. So go to your closet. If you have a sweater that you don't wear, unravel it and see what you can do with the yarn. Anything. You can find a way. If you focus on the joy of it and not the fear and the loss. All right. So that is enough. I hope that you can find some time to unwind with fiber and fabric. I'm going to spend the weekend watching Formula One and doing English paper piecing. Until the next time I can make a video, I send you all the best wishes. I send you all the warmest wishes, and I hope you can find some time to unwind. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.